We want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tonga and Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamuk, Serrano, Kuia, Payam-Kuicham, Ahashiman, Ipai-Tipai, and the Kumeyaay and Quechan peoples whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of those communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement with much more context, authored by the USC Van Hunnick History Department, we invite you to visit their website. And for those of you joining us online, we'd love to know where you're watching from, so feel free to let us know in the chat. We're always eager to see our global community gathering at these events. My name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you in person and those of you joining us on Zoom. Thank you so much for being here. Couple of notes about the Zoom protocols, which are probably unnecessary 4 years after we all started using Zoom, 5 years. So right now, 5 years, wow. You're viewing a side-by-side of the speaker and the slides that are being shared. And if you want to make one larger or smaller, you just drag the line in between them to make one more prominent and one smaller. And we will have time for questions and discussions following the lecture. So for those of you online, please ask them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. And of course, those of you in person, we welcome your participation. For those of you in person, we have lots of food. There are to-go containers in the back. So before you make your graceful exit after the lecture, feel free to grab some more food and enjoy. And those of you online who are not here in person are missing a Brazilian feast today in honor of our speaker. We have amazing Brazilian food. So you should come to our next lectures, not only for the fascinating content and groundbreaking research, but also for the food. We are going to share the chat and the Q&A with Raíssa following the lecture. So if we don't have time to get to your question or your comment, then she will still see it. So please feel free to participate online and obviously in the room. And please be respectful to the speaker and to other attendees. So now to introduce today's lecture, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Gruner. Wolf.
Thank you, Martha, as always, for being the soul of the center and providing these amazing circumstances for everybody and thinking about food. For those who don't know, the center, it was founded in 2014, and what we try to do is to advance new areas of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research on genocide and mass violence. We are promoting research especially with the unique Holocaust and genocide resources here at USC, for example, the Visual History Archive, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies collection here, and the special collections. With this research, what we foster, we try to kind of transform the way how we understand the origins, dynamics, and consequences of mass violence, and especially the conditions and dimensions of resistance. The center in general has a lively program, as many of you know, consisting of annual international conferences. We bestow numerous fellowships, organize workshops, and this lecture series, and other unique research opportunities. And one of those brought Raíssa here. As part of our program, the center welcomes international scholars who want to spend time at the Center for Research if they have secured their own funding. Since our fellowships, unfortunately, are still limited in numbers, we hope we get more via donations, but right now we have a limited number, and so we welcome visiting scholars if they are able to come. And we hosted over the last years 24 of visiting scholars at all academic levels for short periods, like a few weeks, but also up to a year. And if you are interested to being a visiting scholar, please contact the center and visit our website. And this brings me to our today's speaker, Raíssa Alonso. She is a PhD candidate at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. Her dissertation is entitled "The Other Germany in Brazil and the United States, Intellectuals in Exile in the Fight Against Nazism." That might change, maybe, I don't know. We'll see. But she earned her bachelor's in history and her master's in social history, both at the University of São Paulo. She has already a deep experience working with survivor testimonies, which is one of the main sources she's also looking at here. And not only from her master research, but also from an experience serving as a volunteer and associate researcher on a project to record and preserve testimonies from Holocaust survivors who took refuge in Brazil. Raíssa, the project was organized by the Laboratory of Studies in Ethnicity and Racism and Discrimination at the University of São Paulo. And the outcome is an online database called ArcShoah, the virtual archive of Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Raíssa also received the CAPES Foundation scholarship from the Ministry of Higher Education in Brazil for her research. She has presented on this research in various venues, and also at conferences. She earns her living by working as for Editora, FTD, I don't know, a leading textbook publishing house in Brazil. She is editor-in-chief for history textbooks for children, ages 7 to 10, and serves as a consultant and reviewer of several other history collections. Currently, she works in the digital education department, designing educational material for distance learning. We know Raíssa already because for a long time, because she actually was a fellow before she came as a visiting scholar. And she received the 2022-2023 Margie and Douglas Greenberg Research Fellowship at the center and was with us for 1 month researching here in March 23. And I think she thought she has unfinished business here. So she came afterwards, and maybe she enjoyed her time. So she came afterwards to us and with the idea to maybe be hosted as a visiting scholar. And with an invitation from the center, she was able to secure a Fulbright dissertation fellowship, which brought her here for the whole academic year 2024-2025. So she is, just to count, the second Fulbright scholar we host for an entire year here at the center. During her stay, she will work with the resources, or has already worked with the resources at USC, but is also exploring archives in DC and New York. So without further ado, Raíssa, welcome again.
Is it ready? Can I start? Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here, either in person or through Zoom. And I want to thank by beginning by thanking the Fulbright Association and the Brazilian government for funding this research, and also, of course, the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and particular to Wolf and Martha for welcoming this academic year. So what I'm about to present to you guys is part of my doctoral dissertation. And to do that, I need to begin introducing some concepts that I've been working with since my master's. So I started my research studying the German anti-Nazi movements in Brazil during the 30s and the 40s. And even before Hitler came into power in 33, two of these groups were targeted by Nazi ideology, and those were the intellectuals and the artists. And book burnings, intellectual persecution, intimidation tactics, all of these created a climate of fear and worry for a lot of individuals belonging to these segments of society. So when Hitler came into power, there had been a cultural war brewing in the German society. And the Weimar Republic and its defenders were subversive elements who needed to be hunted because they brought ruin to Germans and its society. So during the 30s and the 40s, a lot of Germans left Germany, be it because of political or ethnic persecution. And at first, they started taking refuge in neighboring countries such as France, Switzerland, and England. And as the war went on and more territories became involved in the conflict, they started to think and cross the Atlantic in search for refuge in the American continent. And that was no easy task. Leaving Germany required money, visas, and a lot of courage, of course, because establishing yourself in a different country, well, it involved many challenges, such as a cultural shock, a loss of financial status, and no less important, a language barrier. So getting a visa was a hassle in itself, as many doors began to close as the war went on, particularly to those refugees of Jewish ethnicity. So out of these countries, we highlight here the United States as a preferred destination, because for many, English was a lot closer to what they were used to, and closer and easier than Portuguese or Spanish. And after the First World War, many intellectuals from the US had come to Europe, so a lot of them were in contact with its culture. But even though it was no easy task, because, the general perception of America in Europe was of that of a continent that was newer, a lot more barbaric, and culturally underdeveloped. So, when people came to the US in particular, that was easier, of course, but when people came to LA, for instance, they were quick to point out the differences in the weather, in the culture, and some of them tried their hand at Hollywood, and most of them were not successful. And although some names like Thomas Mann, when they came here, they retained their financial and social status, a lot of those didn't. So even in the Mann family, Reich and Klaus Mann, who were well known in Europe, here they didn't make a big splash. Well, that said, this was to a nicer perception of what many had to say about Brazil, for instance. So this is the case of Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig left Europe, and eventually he came to Brazil in the end of the 30s, where he stayed until his death in Petrópolis. And as you can see, he's very candid about his perceptions. So I love it that he actually says that what he thinks, Brazil was just one of the South American republics, not readily distinguishable from one another, with a hot climate, unhealthy, a political situation that was disturbed, its finances desolate, its administration slovenly, halfway civilized. And well, still, I gotta say that in this article that he published in a US magazine, he eventually changed his mind and he's now singing Brazil's praise. And particularly for him, what was interesting was Brazil's vision of sort of a racial democracy. Completely different from Europe. And part of that was because Jewish people in Brazil were mostly seen as white people. And so it was not exactly like he described, but, I can see why he presents these differences with Europe. But yeah, the first impressions are rough. So back to the visa process, it was really, really hard. At first, they had a quota system in place for the United States, and that was gradually adopted by other Latin American countries as well. And as you can see here, the German quota was never completely fulfilled during the war years. Even though the United States received a lot of German immigrants, they had the capacity to receive a lot more. And that was not just the United States. Brazil, for instance, had promised to give 2,000 visas at request of the Pope back back then. And out of each 2,000 visas, less than 100 were actually given. So artists and intellectuals also faced another big problem, because you see, back then you had a division between good and desirable immigrants and bad ones, which is not new and certainly still in practice in some countries today. But yeah, back then, several countries in the American continent based this distinction on two grounds: whiteness and work aptitude. So most of the Latin American countries like Mexico and Brazil believed in old racial theories on how to better their society. Through eugenics, a controlled entry of Europeans, and forced cultural assimilation, they would progressively eliminate the influences of Black and indigenous people. So Catholic immigrants were seen as more desirable and easier to integrate into society, to the point that some countries like Brazil, they had secret missives to their ambassadors prohibiting them from giving visas to Jewish people. And also, they wanted immigrants to come and settle in their country part, in the rural areas with farming jobs. And that was not the expertise of intellectuals and artists who came from big cities and were accustomed to different, environments. And moreover, through the perception of the governments, these people, they came in with subversive ideologies like anarchism, communism, and they were not well desired. So particularly as the American continent was gradually joining the war, people from Germany, Italy, and Japan were seen with more and more distrust as possible spies for their homeland. And these newcomers, they were expected to fully integrate into society and abandon all ties to their homelands. And yet, German intellectuals and artists who came here to their host countries, well, many realized that they couldn't simply do nothing. And so they began to form their own resistance groups in their communities. So for my master's degree, I studied two resistance groups formed in São Paulo: the Movimento dos Alemães Livres, or the Free German Movement, and the Associação Democrática Alemã, the German Democratic Association. Their goals were really simple: aid in the war effort, counter Hitler's propaganda, and root out fifth columnists that may be hiding in their midst. Nothing big. And yet, all the evidence left by this group was found in the old police records from the 30s. So you see, in 37, Brazil had lived through a coup d'etat. So Getúlio Vargas was elected in the 30s. He extended his power after uncovering this secret plan to overthrow the government, a Jewish Soviet conspiracy. Of course, years later, that was proved as a fraud, but back then, under the justification of national security, he was the strong figure that Brazil needed to stomp out the subversive people. So yeah, a combination of an anti-Semitism and anti-communism, as always. So several laws concerning immigrants were put into place in the following years. So after 37, Germans were not allowed to speak German in the streets, in churches, in schools, anywhere public, basically. So no more written press in German as well. They had to integrate or leave. In March 42, after the Nazis bombed a Brazilian ship, the German community had part of its financial savings confiscated in order to pay reparations to the Brazilian government and its society. So anyway, not only German people were robbed from practicing their culture, but an executive order also forbade any foreigner to take part in political activities under the threat of deportation. And you see, resistance is often thought as something that happens in occupied countries. And yet, the threat of deportation, a very real one, was for many akin to a death sentence. If they were sent back to Germany, they would die. And that was the case with one of the leaders of a revolutionary party, Olga Benário. She was married to Luiz Carlos Prestes, who was the leader of the Communist Party in Brazil. And even though she was pregnant, she was found out by the Brazilian government and sent back to Germany, where she was gassed in 42 with a lot of other political dissidents. And I want to remind you, 42 is the same year that Brazil entered the war, in the side of the Allies. So yeah, this was a really high-profile case. It involved a lot of international associations pleading for her, and so it was, very well known in Brazil, and obviously an intimidation tactic to other people who do the same. So participating in political activities in the countries like Brazil, it was really, really risky. And the groups that I studied during my master's, they were just anti-Nazis. They were not communists, One of the leaders was actually a monarchist. So, his name was Carlos Brand, and he descended from Austrian aristocracy. He was born in Czech Republic. He was an opera director when he came to São Paulo, and he had contacts with like the US embassy, for instance. And he was ever searching for respectability. So when he formed this group, he actually went to the police captain and warned him, I'm forming this group. I would like to request that it may function. He even wrote to the president to do that. And he actually got an answer back. And yet that didn't matter. He was surveilled. The movement was infiltrated. Eventually, everyone was brought into questioning because they suspected him of being a Nazi and a communist. It was called the subversive chameleon in the records. So anyway, these groups that I study, they operated under one concept, the idea of the other Germany. And that idea basically meant that Hitler did not embody the true ideals and values of Germany, most of all its humanist tradition. And so those that resisted Hitler and those who had fled, those who tried to undermine its regime, they were part of this other Germany. Well, first of all, they existed, And so the idea of the other Germany was just to prove that not all Germans were Nazis. And this was important because one day fascism would be defeated and Germany would have to sit at the table of negotiations about its future. So their goal was actually to influence, not in terms of not having a second Versailles Treaty that would, kill the future of Germany. And as I studied these groups and the persecution they face, I came into contact with a whole historiography about the other Germany, because groups centered around this idea, they popped up in most countries of the American continent, as you can see here. Not only that, but they tried as best as they can to keep in touch with each other and form networks so they could, form one day a united front. And many of them had like one goal for this ending. They wanted to form a government in exile, inspired by what the French did. And they were organized. They actually managed to create within the countries a united front. They had people from all sides of the political spectrum, except Nazis, basically. And historiography agreed that we have two main groups, and one in Mexico and one in Argentina. And we based that on the circulation of their newspaper and the reach they had and how they were distributed over many, many countries. So you have Das Andare Deutschland, La Otra Alemania in Argentina, and the Freie Deutschland, the Free Germany in Mexico. And their reach expanded. So many of the groups that you see here, they were affiliated with one or another. And I propose the concept of the other Germany can be analyzed through the following lens: past history and future expectations. Assuming the space of public discussion were the newspapers, we can see two types of articles in there, trying to answer two basic questions. One, how did Germany let Nazism rise and take over power? And second, what path should Germany follow after Hitler is defeated? And theories about what Nazism and fascism are may vary among the followers of this group. So some of them believe that this was an inherent German problem. Some of them just said that this popped up in Germany, but it could have happened, anywhere else. But the right conditions were found in Germany at the time. But this was not nearly as divisive as the answers about the future of Germany. Sure, they all agreed from monarchists to communists that Hitler had to be defeated, but ideologically they diverged on what should be the future? A democratic republic, a communist revolution, a return to monarchy, an incorporation into other countries? And that question was really, really important, because even though they shared the dream of, building a government in exile, it was really important who was going to lead that and what project should be adopted when they had the chance to influence the future of Germany in the table of negotiations. So I'm going to explore a little bit those two movements. So this is the Das Deutschland, and it was founded in 1937 after unifying all smaller anti-Nazi groups that you had in Buenos Aires. And this coalition was driven by three main objectives: providing financial assistance to German refugees, spreading awareness of Nazi Germany's atrocities, and promoting events related to true German culture, distinct from Nazi propaganda. So the founder was August Sinzing, a German historian and also ex-deputy of the Social Democratic Party. And he was forced into exile, and he arrived in Argentina after a brief stay in Switzerland. And he took a position as a teacher at the Pestalozzi School in Buenos Aires. And this was an old institution founded by an older German immigrant, and the school is actually functioning until today. And this was the center for all the activities that this group had. And it was so big that in 1938, they had to move to a larger location. And they got letters congratulating them from high-profile people like Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, and several writers. So Stefan Zweig and Jon Feuchtwanger were actually invited to give lectures at the school. And beyond Argentina, they also had affiliate groups in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Uruguay, and Brazil, and others as well. And these organizations convened in a larger anti-Nazi Congress that happened in Uruguay in 1943, and that was organized by the DAD. And they published their own newspaper. And some historians agree that the reach of this newspaper was 4,000 to 6,000 copies. So that was really, really big. And they had contributions from all over: LA, New York, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay. And the movement had a predominantly liberal and socialist ideological orientation. And on the cultural front, the DAD played a crucial role fostering anti-Nazi culture. So they support German-speaking theater groups. They presented works by Bertolt Brecht and songs by Hans Eisler. Their efforts cemented their status as a vital cultural institution. And so, I mean, this was a really broad coalition. They had some communists in them, but it was mostly a social liberal that believed that the future of Germany should be something akin to the Weimar Republic, with some tweaks, of course. So let's go to Mexico. The Mexico was an interesting situation because this country was one of the few countries that actually supported the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. And after the war, they actually received a lot of the anti-fascist fighters persecuted by the Franco regime. And later, during the war, these anti-fascist fighters that came from Germany and France were welcomed into the country as well. So between 1937 and 1945, Mexico had become a home, temporary or permanently, to several prominent German political and cultural exiled people, including Leon Feuchtwanger, Bodus, Ludwig Renn, Alfred Döblin, Anna Zegers, and they were brought to Mexico by the Liga Pro Cultura Alemana, the League for German Culture. And it was an old organization that played a critical role into bringing people from Europe to Mexico through sometimes controversial means, bribery, some forged passports, whatever it took to keep people safe. And in 1941, these people founded the Freie Deutschland. And they were closely aligned to other Mexican anti-fascist groups. So they worked a lot with the local population, which is something that the GAD had a lot of difficulty. They had a larger German community there, and they mostly spoke to these people. And their monthly newspaper was published until 1946, and it featured literary reviews, essays, short story, and also global news. And contributors came from all over, and not were just German people, but some high-profile people from Latin America, such as Pablo Neruda. And in 1942, they actually started their own publishing house, which was a big achievement. And one of the major publications that they had was El Libro Negro del Terror Nazi in Europa, the Black Book of Nazi terror in Europe, which compiled testimonies from high-profile figures to just explain and divulge to the Mexican society and all the Spanish-speaking society what the Nazis were doing and the atrocities they were committing. And following that success, they decided to create a Latin American committee. And it was their honorary president was Heinrich Mann. And their vice president was the monarchist leader from Brazil that I mentioned. So they were trying to build a lot of bridges. And when you see how Brazil participates in those two groups, you can see that they were trying to be conciliatory, maybe because the leader was not a communist and not a liberal, that could have helped in trying to see beyond the differences. And Mexico, on the other hand, received a number of ex-Communist Party members, and the Freie Deutschland was also in contact with the Soviet Freie Deutschland. And it's important to note that contrary to the official reports that Mexico had, those two groups were not one and the same. The Mexican group actually saw themselves as very independent and not subordinate, which was not exactly the case of how the Soviet group saw the Mexican one. And we come here to the US. And well, here in the US, you had so many newspapers being published, but I'm gonna focus on only two ones that I think are more pertinent to the idea of the other Germany. So the first one, the Anti-Nazi Bulletin, was published by the Anti-Nazi Non-Sectarian League, and it was formed in 1933, right after Hitler came into power. And they spearheaded the movement to boycott German products and published this newspaper to actually inform people on how to aid the war effort. So a lot of the articles are about how unchristian Hitler is and how the women could help in war effort, or how they could, because they were responsible for buying the products that went into the home. So they published lists of like these companies, they finance German atrocities. So yeah, the League had two presidents. The first one was a Jewish lawyer dedicated to legal reform, and he was mostly focused on the boycott thing. And the second one, who assumed after Simon Untermeyer's death, took the League into a whole new direction, focusing on denouncing fascism in the United States. See here. And the second newspaper is the German American, and it was created by the German American Emergency Conference. And it was captained by Kurt Rosenfeld. He was an ex-deputy of the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and he had come to the US in 1934. But the newspaper started in 1942 as the United States started to join the war. And it was interesting because it was written in both English and German, and that depended a lot on who was the audience. So for instance, they had a section called Here the Woman Speaks, and that was published in German. And I think that that was the case because a lot of German women didn't have the chance to leave that house that much. So they weren't as integrated as some other sections of the German society were. And they had a second section called The Voice of the German Youth. And that one was fully published in English. And they had a lot of articles that promoted the idea of a cultural legacy and how they had to embrace, they were not just Americans. So this newspaper, they had close ties to the traders unions here in the US, and they were mostly dedicated to promote a certain, confirmation of rights for immigrant workers here. And they also had close ties to the Freie Deutschland movement in Mexico, but they weren't as communist as the Freie Deutschland. And it's hard to say if they didn't really believed in that, or if they were just promoting another front that was less accepted here as communism was, and they didn't want to be associated with that because their message was more important. So, and they had contributions from Thomas Mann, Heinrich Mann, and some of their contributors actually worked for both the Mexican and the Argentinian newspapers. So they also served a bit as bridges and trying to close the to make the United Front. So all of these groups, they had same strategies. So they had the boycott, as you can see here from the anti-Nazi bulletin, boycotting the Olympics. But they also had fundraisers, promotion of German cultural events, lecture on the rise of fascism, publications in different languages. And also they try to promote integration in this community. So the German American group, for example, they were very big on this holiday called I Am an American Day. So they had a lot of events, and that served to prove their loyalty to the United States. So the education of the audience of the dangers of fascism, fostering the ideals of Germany, that was what they thought it was worth doing. And it's interesting because Karina Petrescu proposed that the intellectual resistance to fascism everywhere, they followed a certain cycle. So in the first moment, they don't believe in the capacity of the enemy to rise to power. And then as they realize the danger, they try to alert the society about it. In the third phase, they don't join the armed fight. So what they can do is actually plan for the future after the fascism is defeated. And on the fourth phase, they lament like their choices, their actions and inactions, and they do a self-review. So they can do better next time. So the other Germany groups followed this cycle to a letter. And the concept of the other Germany was called by researcher Andrea Agox as the anti-fascist humanism, which I agree, because they shared the same cultural substract, even if they had their own differences. And so, as I looked for more connections between these groups, in 2023, I came here with the fellowship from Margie and Douglas Greenberg, for which I will be eternally grateful. And this put me into contact with some FBI files on the people that lived in LA. And looking through several archives and databases since I came back here with the Fulbright Fellowship, I found a complete dossier on the German activities in the American continent. And this was made by the Office of Strategic Service, and it has over 600 pages. And this trove of information had details on groups on every single country, from the US to Paraguay, and their connections to each other. And that got me thinking about the nature of repression. Because from what I had seen, every movement had faced a certain level of repression in their host country. And that was well documented by the historiography. So I studied the Brazilian movement, and then I studied the repression of the Brazilian movement. Other researchers like Professor Claire Kreising, they studied the Mexican movement and their repression. Same thing for Argentina with German Friedman and his DID group. And when you look at these repression tactics, I started to wonder, was there any connection between what each government was doing to their own refugees? And let's point out, let's notice that these are very different countries in terms of governments. So I've gone into some detail about what was happening in Brazil. So it was an authoritarian government. And Argentina, for instance, they were being led by military juntas. And they were not so subtly supporting Germany during the most part of the war. The US, on the other hand, was living through a democratic republic and post-recession government of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So freedom of expression, of living, of everything, that was part of the American way. And patriotism had led them to abandon their isolationist position after the Pearl Harbor attacks, and they were using all of their resources to fight for the Allies, be it the military or the propaganda produced by Hollywood. Mexico, as I've mentioned, was the only country that accepted communists. They had Leon Trotsky in their midst. So several ex-members of the Communist parties were there, resistance fighters in the Spanish Civil War, and yet they also did a lot of repression to the German community. And looking through the history of this resistance from each of these countries, it became impossible to ignore the similar attacks, the same worries and the same perceptions of the German community. And other things became apparent as well. So in the 20s and 30s, most of these countries, they were forming their own intelligence agencies, and they were forming their police movements and special forces operations. So like in this case, so you have, for instance, the OSS and the FBI. In Argentina, you had the Committee for Anti-Argentinian Activities. In Brazil, you had the Department of Special Operations during the Vargas government. And these were all backed up by eugenic societies that were used as justification to persecute immigrants. And two questions were central to my research. Why are these anti-Nazi groups being targeted, even though they fight for the same goals of these countries? And how did countries with such different alignments came to the same conclusion about immigrants policy that affected so deeply the German community? And I first began wondering about their connection in terms of like policies and political activities. And through the analysis of these newspapers, we can see a conflicted relationship with the host countries. Strategies may vary, but they were very torn into wanting to be accepted by the host country and its society, but also criticizing when they felt that was needed. So in Argentina, you had the Committee of Anti-Argentinian Activities, and they judged August Simpson as a very dangerous individual. So the DAD newspaper, it had become a vehicle not only to criticize the German Reich, but also to criticize the authoritarian measures that were being put into practice in Argentina, and also to pressure them into joining the war. And that was not well seen. And so here we have a letter addressed to the committee made by Ernesto Alemán, which is one of the oldest members, vouching for the community of the DAD and the Pestalozzi school. And that didn't help at all. Eventually, in 52, August Simpson, tired of the persecution, he went back home to the communist Germany. So yeah, and the DAD, they were infiltrated. August Simpson had people following home. And once again, these were anti-Nazi groups, not communist ones or Nazi ones, which were both very active in Argentina. And in Mexico, even though they were incentivized by the government, the Free Germans were also a source of concern for its connections to Moscow and their resistance. So visas became really hard to obtain after a certain point, and information about leaders of these movements like Anna Seghers and Ludwig Rein ended up in reports in the United States, not only in Mexico. And there's this researcher, Carlos Inclán, who wrote extensively about the arrest and forced deportation to internment camps. And this was in Perote, Veracruz, and where part of the German community and also the Japanese community and some of the Italian community were put there and to be surveilled during the war. And so they did have also their own, they also faced persecution. In Brazil, as I've mentioned, every newspaper was closed down. Every movement and its members were called in for questioning. And here you have a censored and intercepted correspondence between Stefan Baron, who was the leader of the German Democratic Association, to the Das in Deutschland. And this was never delivered. And they had a really big record on Stefan Baron because he was into contact also with the Mexican movement. And eventually he was deported in 49, and I couldn't find any more traces of him. So you can see that the persecution of the Brazilian government, it went on well after the war. And then we come to the US. So the relationship between these newspapers and the US government was also complicated. So the anti-Nazi bulletin, for instance, when they started to publish the boycott, they were really hard on the Olympics boycott and the US participation in this Olympics. And not only that, they started to analyze how fascism came into place in the United States and what form it would take. And They infiltrated several movements like the Klan, like America First, and they compiled extensive records that were published and sent to US officials. And that led into nothing. That only earned them a place of like, okay, these are very organized people that we have to keep an eye on. And well, there is a book here called Common Nazis, made by Alexander Stefan, and he delved into the FBI files that were made for German intellectuals and artists surveilled by the government. And this book, it explores the deep and complex relationship between the surveillance systems and that was practiced by the FBI, the OSS, and the Office of Censorship with the German community. And even though this worked a little bit differently, they didn't censor necessarily the correspondence or their works, they were still seen as with distrust, and they had their privacy invaded. Letters read, and even their own property was trespassed. Because during the war, President Roosevelt set explicit instructions to make sure the United States wouldn't be infiltrated by individuals with suspicious ideologies, including Nazism and communism. And these tactics range from like taped phones, following up vehicles or individuals, and even included digging through the trash of some residences, which was what happened with Thomas Mann. And then, well, you can see the similarities between these repression tactics. But I ask myself, are they just utilizing the same tactics, or is there an actual connection or a coordinated effort? And I have two pieces of evidence that point me in the second direction. First, that dossier that I already mentioned, made by the OSS and the FBI, because it has a level of detail that struck me like a bolt of lightning. That kind of information meant one of two things. Either the US had been employing agents in every country investigated, or this kind of information had to be obtained with the cooperation of every country mentioned. And now, far from me to doubt the lengths that the CIA and the FBI would go for information. But we are talking here about records that show private conversation, tapped phones, number of members, and, well, internal strives even, and their connections. So even though there are no direct mentions to officers from both of these countries, from all the countries talking to each other, it feels very likely to me that that has happened at some point. And also let me point out here, I am not trying to say that United States coordinated and ordered the repression of every political refugee in each country. That is not it. They had a big importance, of course, in the grand scheme of things. But what I'm talking about is these countries, they had the same goals, the same ideas of national security. So they collaborated with each other. And you can see that, for instance, in the report of the Anti-Argentinian Commission, when they talk, they have like proof and correspondence between the ambassadors of Brazil and also Uruguay, because they were tightening their own internal borders, because a lot of the refugees, they came first to Brazil and then they moved to Argentina and vice versa, or Uruguay. That was really common, and they wanted a more secure borders. So this is my second piece of evidence. It is also not conclusive, but it just suggests a broader organization, because during the years of the war, there was a tradition that began in the 20th century of countries of the American continent convening to discuss subjects or national interests with each other. And during the war between 39 and 42, there were 3 special conventions just to talk about the war efforts. And even though when they were in a state of neutrality, how they would handle their political relationship with Europe. And these reports are now public. They can be found online, and you can find them in Spanish, you can find them in Portuguese, or even in English. And they contain resolutions approved by all the countries that were in this convention. So in the first one, Article 12 emphasizes the importance of not letting foreigners with subversive ideologies into the continent. And this was a task that they delegated to each country to control their own borders and enforce security. In the second convention in 40, more measures were applied. They were trying to combat the falsification of passports, and also they set guidelines for the entry of these individuals into countries. And this was a great concern, particularly in the US, about the internal migration, because the US visa took a long time. So a lot of them, they just applied for any country that wanted them, that would accept them. And some of them would come to Brazil or so to Mexico or other countries while they awaited the visa for the US. And so the measures in this report, they suggest that they were trying to coordinate the internal security, not just the guidelines of like people coming from Europe. And in the same convention, Article 6 reinforces the sovereign right of each republic to combat and repress dangerous ideologies and their propagators. It highlights that while these measures were to be applied by each country according to their own constitution, you could ask for help internationally. And also, but sharing and exchanging information was also crucial to these efforts. And so, for instance, let's imagine that the police in São Paulo found out about this plan that would involve Argentina. It was their obligation to actually warn the Argentinian officials about it. So they had a lot of other recommendations, such as disarming the foreign population and also distributing propaganda in several languages to try to counter Hitler's propaganda. And they also suggested in 42 to restrict the freedom of movement of what they called suspicious individuals. So that was mostly Germans, Japanese, and Italians. And they should at least be surveilled and should be particularly surveilled if they were participating in any political activities, which was forbidden by them. So all of these recommendations, they either were already in practice in most of these countries or they were gradually put into place. And the fear expressed in these reports, be them produced by the international conferences or by each of the national states police, were the same: the infection of the national body with foreign ideologies, particularly communism. And it's interesting because, of course, Nazism was in their, list of preoccupations, but they mentioned communism way more than they mentioned Nazism. And so it got me thinking about the future of these conventions was going to be into the Cold War, and some of these practices were already in place. And some of these collaborations were already happening. And this started way earlier than we think it did. So my research is still ongoing. I hope to find out more about the possible collaborations between the countries. And I feel that these are particularly relevant to society today and how we deal with resistance and repression. Because this repression affected directly the resistance movements in our countries. And even if they were anti-Nazis, even as they tried to prove themselves loyal to their hosts, well, they were distrusted. They couldn't escape the stigma of being of a certain country because of their national origin. And there's this French historian called Raíssa Alonso, and he has a book called Myths and Political Mythologies. And he proposes that there are underlying narratives that are applied across all the political spectrum, and they can be dressed up the way we want. So one of these myths that he explores is the conspiracy. And it is led by the archetypical foreigner who works in the shadow and who's trying to undermine the order and the unity of a certain society. And this foreigner, be it the Jewish conspiracy, be it the German communazi, is an element that must be ousted and shunned for society. They are dangerous, criminal, subversive forces. And this is interesting because when you look at it, that is the same way that Nazi Germany was also treating these people. This is what they were fleeing in the first place. And the second myth that he actually explores, that I also find it very interesting for today, because the first one, well, you could argue that this is the basis of xenophobia and persecution. The second one is that there's going to be a savior. And this savior will dismantle the conspiracy and put everything right. And it also can come in many forms. Sometimes it's the newcomer, the guy who is outside politics, and that's gonna, fix everything because he has simple solutions. He knows what society needs. But it also can be a veteran of war, someone who has a lot of experience, that has led before, and now it's being called to action again because his country needs him. And that's still a very popular underlying narrative nowadays. And this savior, he's allowed to use any methods he wants in the name of national security. So forced deportations, surveillance, unlawful arrests. And we know that this is a very slippery slope to follow in society. And so the threats faced by the German members of the resistance in the American continent cannot be minimized. Their echoes are felt until today in the way that we treat immigrants in the 21st century. And these people, they resisted. They resisted at great personal risk. And, even if their goals, the government in exile, or transforming the German community, or convincing society that they were not Nazis, they were not exactly met with success. Their actions are not meaningless. And these actions, they show to us that resistance, in what form it takes, however successful it is, to whatever authoritarian measures are imposed, even by democratic governments, well, resistance is always possible, and it's always a choice. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Raíssa. You can stay
Oh,
there.
yeah,
if
the
you like.
questions,
Yeah.
of course. I don't know why.
We're gonna open it
So-
up for questions for those of you in the room. Raíssa, do you mind calling on people?
Yeah, of course.
And then online, you can ask using the Q&A feature, and I'll raise my hand and ask.
Okay, so
It's a very interesting presentation. Thank
thank
you.
you.
I just wanted to know, what was the name of the French historian again?
Raoul Girardet.
Raoul what?
Raoul Girardet.
Girardet.
Yeah. I don't think his book is published in English. I found a version of it in Portuguese, which you can read, and also in French, of course.
Thank you so much for such an incredible presentation. It's always so much fun listening to you talk about your research. I was just wondering, to what extent were these anti-fascist movements thinking, critically engaging with the racial hierarchies and social organization of the countries that they're organizing within? You showed the one cartoon with like the reference to the KKK, and I'm just wondering if you're noticing that amongst like multiple countries, or if it's happening in specific contexts.
Okay, so it all depends on each country and also the way they are read into society, because for instance, in Argentina, the idea of the whitening of the population was sort of already accomplished. They had, they didn't have like the same level of slavery, of Black people slavery, and they did exterminate a great part of their indigenous movements. So for instance, when they came to Argentina, Jewish people were more recognized, to the point that even after the war, during the dictatorship that they had, during prison, some of them were led to believe that they were back in Nazi Germany. People would talk in German, people would, put screens and make effects to seem like they were being gassed. So that's not the case in Brazil. In Brazil, a lot of them were incorporated as white people. And Mexico, for instance, had a very interesting relationship, because while they were very closely connected to the local community, Professor Clark Rising argues that they were also very condescending, trying to teach them how to actually organize themselves. And so for a lot of these communities, it was really hard to integrate. Like the São Paulo community, it mostly kept to itself because the language barrier was, for many of them, unsurmountable. And that's not the case necessarily in other, like the Argentinian group, they actually had a political division of like, okay, some people, they were politically persecuted, and some people, they were racially persecuted. And, some of the racial persecution, some of these people, they would be very glad to see the political persecution, and they wouldn't have cared about Nazi Germany if it didn't affect them personally. And so, for instance, the GAG, they had a lot of Jewish members, but they also had a second newspaper called the Weekly Jewish, the Jüdische Wochenschau or something. And so they had their own preoccupation. In the United States, these two newspapers, Kurt Rosenfeld was Jewish, but I think Samuel Untermeyer was not. And they did have one other newspaper that I don't get into it a lot and called the Aufbau. And this one was actually for the Jewish community and how to integrate society and what Jewish persecution was. So as you can see, it's sort of like a case by case basis. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Raíssa. It was so many interesting points that I will try to address in one question in general, because as you said, mentioned, the differences in each country are diverse, but you are trying to give this general thing, and I see then also some correlations between the countries of how organized was this repression on people who were trying to organize resistance. And at the same time, also inside these resistant groups as well, the divergences that they have with each other, trying to also maybe more going into the war and after the war, that they started to do denunciations among themselves as well. How much that was also profited by, let's see, then more the general tendency of trying to control each country, but also in how far was correlation between the countries as well. If you can find, did you find something that would say, for example, Argentina and Bolivia or Uruguay were doing correlated things, even though the governments were completely different and had different approaches, or were changing also very much from dictatorship to democracy, etc., and keeping an eye of repressing those people and utilizing them as a double agents, kind of. Those as denouncing, for example, their own people, because some were social democrats and were denouncing some communists, for example, or some that were Catholic social democrats denouncing other Jewish activities. And so
Yeah, that actually happened, at least that I know of, that happened in Brazil a lot. But not only in Brazil, because in the United States, the OSS had a separate report about the internal strife in the German movements. So they were aware that they had divergences, and they were trying to exploit them and play one against the others, at least in the international level. And in Brazil, that I know of, the monarchist leader, Carlos Cipriano, he was called into questioning about Stefan Baron, who had more communist tendencies. And he gladly denounced, at least according to, we have to take police records with a grain of salt. We don't know what kind of pressure he was suffering, but he did denounce. And there was another report of one of the activists that was in the south of Brazil, who went to the Congress in Uruguay, and he came back with a full report detailing the different factions and how dangerous they were to society. So yeah, I think like they played up a lot into the conflicts inside of these movements. And since they did have infiltrated people, I suppose that this was played up in a lot of senses. And I still haven't got to everything that I want to analyze. This is for future research, because I do have a dissertation to write this year. And I want to analyze further to see other connections, because I'm sure there are, that they exist. And so yes, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. I was struck by the kind of transnational connections. First, with kind of for these newspapers, the anti-Nazi Otto Alemannia, that they have contributions from the US, but also from other countries. And I wonder, when you talk about repression, were there interferences, for example? How was the information transfer? How did they, and my main question is actually, were they aware of the kind of transnational connections regarding the surveillance and repression? Because when you are in Argentina, you might not be aware what is happening in Paraguay or Mexico, but if you are connected to these organizations and individuals, you might get information about this. So did you find out anything about this?
Yeah, well, particularly in Argentina, with the Committee of Anti-Argentinian Activities, I found correspondence between ambassadors. But I assume that most of the connections and the information that they had of other transnational groups came from intercepting correspondence, because that, as I show with Stefan Baron, they wrote to each other a lot, to the point that some of them began adopting pseudonyms and other names, and they didn't make their contributions very clear. But, you know, having a look at the whole of the newspapers, you can figure out some of their identities based on the descriptions that they are giving from the national situations. And so I think that this information, at least that I can be very sure of, it's obtained by the questioning and by the correspondence that was intercepted. But I do suspect that there is another level of communication that that was suggested by the correspondence between Argentina and its ambassadors in other countries. But I still haven't found a direct link in that level, but I think that it exists. That's my suspicion.
But were these groups aware of the transnational surveillance?
That's debatable. I do think that they were aware at some level. I think they were aware that their correspondence was being opened, for instance. But I don't think they were aware of the infiltrations and the questionings that everyone went through. And well, I think that became more clear as the war went on. But I don't think, for instance, Thomas Mann was aware that there were people digging through his trash, you know. So yes, that's what I think.
Thanks so much. This is a great presentation. Fun to listen to. I've been reading a bit lately about this greater attention paid to deportations of Germans and Italians and Japanese from Latin America. And the link between, I guess the question is about the link between deportation and internment in the hemisphere.
Wow.
And you know, whether there was, as we know now, the vast majority of German Americans or Japanese Americans that were interned had nothing to do with the Nazi Party or with the Japanese Fascist Party. So I'm wondering if there was if opportunities arose for solidarity across the lines of the internment camp, whether there was an effort on some of these immigrant groups to advocate for people that had been interned in American camps, or at the time it was just taken for granted or assumed that because these people were interned, they were politically suspicious.
That is really hard to tell, actually, because I don't think that all the groups were aware that these internment camps existed. For instance, I think the Mexican group was not fully aware of that, even though, as Carlos Inclán explains, these internment camps were directly linked with the interests of the United States and the whole oil dispute. I know that there is also a program that brought particular Germans from Central America to the United States to be interned, I think in Texas, but I don't see this mentioned in any of the newspapers. I don't know if that's the kind of thing that they wouldn't talk publicly about, but yes, I feel that this is still a complicated subject, that maybe I plan to analyze some correspondence between movement leaders. Maybe in the private sphere of discourse that can show up, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions on Zoom.
Okay.
One from Turko Streda from the University of Southern Denmark. And he first thanks you and then says, to which extent did local Nazis in Brazil and Argentina, for example, participate in the surveillance of refugees from Germany?
Oh, They did. They definitely did. In Argentina, you had a demonstration of the Black Front that reunited over 2,000 people, just to show that they were organized and that they were ready to fight. And part of what we know about August Simpson and some of the members were that they were denounced and by Nazi collaborators, because the German community in Argentina was really, really big in terms of, and most of these, the immigrants, they came at the end of the 19th century. So it was a rife place for propaganda to brew. They still had visions of because that happens a lot with the diaspora. People get stuck in an image of the past. So a lot of these people, they thought about what Hitler was trying to do, linked to the empire that they, escaped from. And so, yes, I mean, I feel like there is sufficient intervention of the Nazi connections. I think in Brazil, that is a little bit more complicated, because since they were all taught as Nazis, and some of them, they were in contact with the movement in Canada from Otto Strasser. And Otto Strasser is mentioned in every newspaper because he is a nuisance, because he's not anti-Nazi. You could say that he's anti-Hitler because he was part of the Nazi party, and then his brother was assassinated in the Night of the Long Knives, and then he escaped and came to Canada, where he founded another movement called Freie Deutschland. And he had a platform in several newspapers, mainstream newspapers in Brazil and Argentina, and he was a Nazi. So a lot of the movements suffered through these connections, and some of the people were kind of ready to forgive him for his Nazi connections, saying that he was reformed, such as Lustig Brun. And this is sort of like saw by the governments as proof of their Nazi connections. And so they interrogated other Nazis about it. And but every single testimony was also taken with a grain of salt. They don't trust any of these people that were denouncing in each other, but it's all in the records anyway. So I hope I answered that question.
There's another kind of factual question about immigration. How many people from Germany and Austria were able to flee to Latin America, and what percentage of those are Jews? So I guess asking about kind of the makeup of the people, the refugees.
Okay, so this is a hard question for me, because first of all, they had separate quotas, Austrian and German people. And in some countries like Brazil, they had a separate quota for Jewish people. So it is kind of hard to keep track of each of these numbers. What you can say is that in terms of proportion, for instance, the United States was in the first place of receiving immigrants. Brazil and Argentina were sort of tied with second place. And Mexico had a very small community, actually, of German people. And so in Brazil, what we can say is that almost 30 to 40% of the German community came during the Second World War. So you have this big increase, and also this big strife between different generations of immigration. But in terms of hard numbers, I am so sorry. I can't recall them in this exact moment. I can answer that later if you give me your email.
We'll share the chat with you.
Please. Okay.
Yeah, related to one of the questions, I know for Brazil, there were a lot of people in the government that were themselves Nazi sympathizers.
Yeah.
So how did that impact the program of surveillance?
Well, I guess it impacted a lot because in a certain sense. So like, for instance, we know that in Rio de Janeiro, they had a captain of police who was very pro-Nazi. And so a lot of these movements, they sort of went underground during that period. And when that guy was replaced by someone who had more US sympathies, they became a little bolder for that matter. And the same thing happened in the South. In the South was really interesting because one of the captains of police, he actually believed that there were anti-Nazis. So he collaborated in a certain sense with some of the anti-Nazis groups. And so you see, it's hard to paint repression as with one broad stroke. Like people tend to think about Nazis or authoritarian governments as a single body where everyone thinks the same way. And it's not, you know, there's a lot of individual expression through this repression. So a lot of them, for instance, they had their letters censored, but they got the letters in the end. Some of the letters disappeared. It all depended on the goodwill of whoever was intercepting them. And yeah, the relationship between Brazil and Nazism is very complicated because Vargas had some fascist sympathies. And there is this one high-profile officer called Filinto Miller, who was openly pro-Nazi, and he was countered by Oswaldo Aranha, who was the Minister of External Relations, and he was very pro-US. And in the end, Vargas ended up in the US side, partially because the US funded a lot of the national industries that we were seeking to develop back then. So it was less an ideological question because he toed the line, you know, until 42, and more a very practical one. And then when we entered the war, some of these officials that were pro-Nazis, they were demoted. Not all of them, but some were. So that is a very complicated relationship. That's
So in your presentation, there's another question. In your presentation, you really ended in a powerful way about the kind of lessons for the present and for the future. So this viewer says, thank you for your amazing presentation. I would like to know how you see the resurgence of neo-Nazi groups in South America and how it could reflect on the region's political and social stability.
okay, so this is not my focus, but I've been following some of the research about it, and we do have a lot of neo-Nazi groups, and they are more organized than we would like to think, and they are getting bolder. Like for instance, we had some pro-Palestine protests in São Paulo, and they thought, some neo-Nazi groups, they thought that was a great opportunity to show up and lend their voices. And I'm glad to say they were kicked out, identified and kicked out immediately, but they are more active nowadays. So what I feel is that in a certain way, there is also a transnational connection nowadays between the far right and the whole world. So you see, for instance, a lot of the members in far-right groups in Brazil espousing some views and some symbols that originated here in the US. So the idea of that symbol like this and the glass of milk, they became more normalized and more dog whistles, I guess, in Brazil. So yeah, I think we still have a lot to fight for here, and it's not, you know, when I began my research, I wanted to do something that was relevant to society, but you know, I chose a subject about something that happened, you know, over 70 years ago. And then suddenly, during the course of my studies, it became way more relevant than I ever expected, and which, I mean, it helped me a lot to go through to see how intellectuals resisted that. Just wish it wasn't so necessary today.
Well, on that note, well, thank you again for your amazing lecture. Well, here, our next event is 2 weeks from today, the same time and place, and it is on agriculture, counterinsurgency, and development in Guatemala. So please join us. Thank you.